Because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot of enemies.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of In Defense of Virology. My name is Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm joined once again by Simon Wain-Hobson. Simon, how are you doing today?
Fine, very well, thanks. Very well.
Today, we're going to talk about your most recent essay, which is on the Biosafety Now Substack, titled WHO Wordplay on COVID Origins. And in that essay, you're talking about the recent SAGO report that was described in detail in a Nature a Nature comment that appeared on February 24th, 2026, called COVID's Origins, What We Do and Don't Know. So we're going to talk about your comments related to peer review and the role of journals in the COVID origins discussion. So can you go ahead and tell us about the focus of your essay?
Sure. So SAGO is this WHO World Health Organization panel that was set up to look into, amongst other things, the origins of novel pathogens. It was set up after the COVID pandemic, not before. So it's a reflex to the COVID pandemic. They submitted a 78-page report that was published in June 2025. And a 78-page report, you would think, well, everything is there. Why do they need 5 more pages in a Nature article? So that's the first odd thing. And so anyway, Nature gave them 5 pages, which is precious reading space for those who read Nature. And they basically resume what they said. So there's nothing new in the article whatsoever. It's signed by most of the members of the committee, who I think the 23 out of 27. Okay, so they come into discussing it, and they come up with a larger number of remarks, some of which show that they don't know the virology terribly well. For example, they mentioned the 2 lineages broke out in the Wuhan seafood market. And of course, this is not true. The 2 are intrinsically related. One was derived from the other. And if you can't understand, if you can't grapple with that, then there's something wrong. This is the sort of thing that a master's level student would have been taught and would have seized. So there's something wrong there. They say very early on, they say that most of the peer-reviewed scientific evidence supports the natural origin, which is correct. They then go on to say, but of course, we've requested additional information, and which is not being forthcoming. For example, they requested information from intelligence sources across the globe and the Chinese government. This information has not been forthcoming. So they give you a sort of conclusion, and then they take it back with the other hand immediately. So the first thing is, let's get into this peer-reviewed process, because it comes up time and time again. So the process with getting a piece of scientific research into print is the following: you write it up, you submit it to to a journal, you upload it, and it's most often than not, if it's a top journal, they say no, thank you. It's refused out of hand. There's a sort of a cursory glance in the editorial office of Nature Cell Science, and they send it back. This is perfectly obvious and understandable. They receive so many manuscripts, they simply can't handle them all. They turn them back. Other journals, particularly the higher the profile of the journal, the more they get turned back without a review by scientists. The people in these offices were former scientists. They've got PhDs. They probably had a career of 5 to 10 years, and they moved into science publishing. They're not cold-faced scientists, and they just don't have the knowledge to handle the immense data. So then they do a first screen, and then they send those manuscripts that they've retained, and they send them out to experts in the field, people who are supposed to understand the subject. They're often competitors because they know the subject best. Anyway, this comes back, and it's usually 2. Sometimes it can be 3 if there's a conflict between reviewers. It can be sometimes as many as 5. Then it goes to the editorial committee, and they say, well, okay, is this good? How does it compare to all the other manuscripts that we have? And in the peer review process, you have a hardcore analysis of this paper. And then the journal will ask you a number of more subjective questions like, do you think this is suitable for our journal? So they're asking you for an opinion. They, of course, make the final decision. So it's not just a hard analysis of the paper. There is opinion in there. And of course, we all know, the scientists know that this can be used to kill a paper from a competitor. It happens. We know it. You can't say this doesn't exist. Not often, but it happens. So this is the process. And then Nature or Science or Cell or all the others, Journal of Virology, then just make an editorial decision, and then they take responsibility, and then they go on to publish it, and then it becomes a manuscript which is turned into a scientific paper. Now, it's been seen by 2 people. So basically, it's beginning of what in industry you call quality control, but it is not. Quality control starts with publication. It doesn't finish, which means that once it's published, when a scientist sees it, he said, oh, that's interesting. Is it right? And you start looking at it, and then you start using your knowledge, and you start going through it, and you see if you think there's a mistake in that. And it's the real peer review, if I put it in inverted commas, starts with publication. You don't know, there might be a scientist in Japan or Norway or Argentina or somewhere in Salt Lake City or in Paris or Rome who will spot something that those 2 reviewers did not see. And papers can come apart. There was a famous paper in Nature. It was published, sensational paper on stem cells, but we won't get into the details. And it started coming apart in 3 weeks post-publication. It was peer-reviewed by some of the top people in the field, and they didn't see it, and it fell apart, and it fell apart badly, and it was so embarrassing that I think one person actually committed suicide, one of the authors. It was a horrible affair. Many papers stand the test of time. Some turn out to be, well, it looked good, but it ended up to be sort of, an incremental advance in science. And of course, amongst all those papers that come out, you have the big ones that have real depth, and they advance the field. So peer review is the beginning of quality control. That's all. Doesn't mean that paper is right, perfect, brilliant.
Even prior to COVID, there were many people that were concerned that the journal system was doing a lot of damage to the credibility of science, in the sense that the process itself involved, was not that transparent. There was a lot of gatekeeping. Single individuals were making decisions that would be influencing fields. That is to say, if you can publish your paper in a top journal, then that paper, without really seeing the impact, like before it actually is known what the impact of that paper is, it has a disproportionate effect
Yes.
on science that will flow from it.
Yes.
So I, myself and others were, even before COVID, arguing that the journal system should be abolished, essentially. What this episode shows is sort of a different problem, in a sense, which is that what I would say, you're seeing the abuse of the peer review and journal system, where the gatekeeping and the keeping findings out of the literature creates a downstream effect where organizations like SAGO, or we can talk about like the Government Accountability Office, relying upon what's in the published literature to communicate summarize the state of our current state of understanding. So you've now poisoned the well, so to speak.
Absolutely. So I was sort of try to be a little bit pedagogical and explain the process, and I actually got into the guts of this piece in Nature. So peer review, you can hate it, and many people do. You can say we should replace it. Certainly, the big improvement by putting on these pre-publication servers, and people can have a look at it before. That is excellent. That is good quality control. The journal process has been pretty good in now with the everyone is so connected. I think we can really ask whether we still need it. But let's keep on with this SAGO and peer review. So peer review serves us well. There are gatekeepers. So these happen to be big, influential people, and that's fine. But sometimes they don't like their own pet hypothesis being pushed over. Particularly, it comes from some younger researchers. So there is gatekeeping. But there's another form, is when we're not going to get into the details of one particular branch of virology, say, but when things start to go wrong, like dangerous gain of function or COVID origins, the idea that it could have been made in a lab, or going back to dangerous gain of function, the shock of realizing that some people were revving up viruses and making new viruses, human viruses, which are indistinguishable from any biological weapons program. And when we get onto the sort of the downside of science, everything we were speaking before, well, let's call about the upside. Okay, your paper, it has an incremental, but it's slightly up, and you have some wonderful papers, beautiful papers that really advance the field. So that's big up. But what about the downside? And we saw with dangerous gain of function that this editorial in the Washington Post in 2011 from Dr. Fauci and Collins, well, that basically had a chill effect. No one would go out and say, no, you shouldn't be doing this, because people at the top of their NIH, so they sterilized the field. And in the case of COVID origins, very early on, and listeners will know, you had these two papers, one in Nature Medicine and the famous proximal origins paper, and another which was basically a rally call in the Lancet from a group of people with conflicts of interests. I mean, most people had some sort of conflict of interest. And saying that this, not only is the virus obviously a natural virus, well, firstly, we've done this before in previous podcasts. You can't say that because there was no data anyway, either way. So you're basically telling people what you want them to believe. You're manipulating the facts, and they have become a part. So when scientists use their elbows to try and fix science ahead of the data, this is when peer review becomes obnoxious and breaks down, because this sets you up not as just a gatekeeper. This closes the gate. So the others can't get their oar in, or they can't raise questions, or they can't dispute this. You have censorship. And there was a call in, I think, a journal of virology, and I've commented on this paper, called Censoring, a Censor Virology. And they basically say people who to try to discuss the lab leak origin should be censored, and articles should be pulled. And I can't even remember the text, but it's outrageous. It's an essay you can find if you look at Censor Virology on the Biosafety Now website. The people who do the work forge the consensus, and that can take 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 years. But it's not a group of people who set them up as priests, because that's what they're doing. They're gatekeepers calling priests, saying, we know we are the defenders of the faith. They're self-anointed, and this is really the bad side, because when the scientists can't trust their scientist friends, the scientific process breaks down. There is an inherent trust, is that when a colleague publishes a paper, I look at that and I will read that manuscript and that paper, and I will take it in good faith. But science is so hard that you can get things wrong, or you can miss something, or you can touch tangentially the truth, but you don't get to the heart of it. And when you can't trust your colleagues, the whole scientific enterprise breaks down. And so that's why self-anointed gatekeepers, or podcasts, or Twitter comments, or editorials, op-eds in the Washington Post, or premature strikes from Nature Medicine like Proximal Origins, they're a disaster. They strike at the base of science, and it makes science less efficient. Therefore, the science money is less efficiently invested. And this is not a way it should do. It should be done. It's awful. And then, of course, mistrust. Now, the knock-on effect of this is that science journalists, there's no way they have the scientific knowledge to get into the small differences that you and I could find and criticize in a paper. So when, say, Carl Zimmer comments on a paper that's come out in Nature, New York Times readers, since Carl Zimmer is an established writer and was one of the big pens in the New York Times, we've got into this position that if it's commented on, say, in the Washington Post, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, whatever, it's true. For us, you and me, when a paper comes out, the first thing you say, that's interesting. Is there an error? We say it's optimistic skepticism. You've got to look at it. Did they miss something? And you've got to look into there. And you trust your colleagues, but you know they could have missed something because you have yourself missed things in the past. It's not possible for people, scientists like you and me, to have a career where we can say, well, I missed nothing in my career. It's just not possible. You hit something tangentially. You didn't get it right and the competitor got it right. Fine. That doesn't matter who. It's that we get things right. And it's tough, and you can miss things. And so when you read it in the New York Times, you must still ask, oh, isn't that interesting? But you have to say, let's see how it pans out. And I mustn't hold this up as gospel because it might not be.
One of the things what you mentioned was the 2024 Journal of Virology article the title says the harms of promoting the lab leak hypothesis for SARS-CoV-2 origins without evidence, right?
Yes.
That was what you're referring to.
And evidence for them is in scientific journals. So it's circular.
Right.
The
Exactly.
people who are saying that are the gatekeepers themselves, and therefore they're not the gatekeepers, they're the gate blockers. And therefore, you can't get anything out. So this brings us to our next point, is that in particularly COVID origins. So this got a lot of people looking, and Drastic was a group of like-minded people who sort of say, well, where's the data? Let's have a look at the data. And they were outsiders to the peer review science system. But they have produced some wonderful pieces of work. Gilles Demoneux's study on proximal origins is a masterpiece. A scientist who would be proud to have done such a piece of work, of research. US Right to Know has unearthed all these emails showing you the timelines and the contradictions. It's a wonderful piece of sleuthing. But if the sleuths are Sherlock Holmes types people with good brains, then you and I go for data. And if it's outside of a peer-reviewed journal, we're not afraid of that because we've got training and we can sort of say, yeah, I can handle that. And I will have no qualms in saying that those US Right to Know articles on proximal origin and Gilles Demoneux's piece are wonderful pieces of work. That is hardcore, excellent. And if you say, well, it's not peer reviewed, you're stacking the decks, because you're basically saying that only information that gets beyond the gatekeepers and the gate blockers is valid, and that's a circular argument. Peer reviewed, by and large, okay, until something goes wrong. Science doesn't like criticism. It doesn't take criticism. And instead of opening up, they close the hatchets. We saw this, was a time when it was a suggestion from a journalist, not the most powerful of journalists, but that HIV might have been started by an oral polio vaccine campaign, and in East Africa. And of course, the scientific community said, no, out of hand, no, not possible. And I wrote a review of the book, and I was sure, I was asked actually by Nature Medicine to write a review of the book, and I read it in 3 days. It was over 1,000 pages. And I said to myself, I'll find the smoking gun, I'll find a big hole. And I couldn't find a big hole. And so I said, be careful. And a colleague wrote a thing in a book review in Nature, basically blasted it out of the water. But it was just prejudice, pure prejudice. And so anyway, with Robin Weiss, we organized a meeting at the Royal Society to discuss this very tense and painful topic, because from HIV we had learned that you have to take things head on. You can't push them under the carpet. You can't put your head in the sand, because it will come out. And the HIV community ended up playing open house. And I don't think the other areas of virology, like the flu people, understood. We understood you had to be open. And when it was tackled openly and with people present in the room, that we had journalists there, we had there was a press conference at the end. We had 5 TV crews. We had the principal protagonists in the issue. And one of the journalists, he said to me on the side, because he said, Simon, it's clearly not true, because if you'd been covering up something, you wouldn't have behaved. You wouldn't have had a meeting. You wouldn't have had a press conference, and you wouldn't have invited us in. So he said, for me, and he had assimilated the evidence, and I had discussed with him some of the evidence. And by that time, when we looked at the hard scientific process, and it was clear that it wasn't true. A close shave, actually, but not true. And so therefore openness sort of skewered, and I'm very uncomfortable hypothesis at the time, and put it to rest. It's by doing things openly, and the press respected us for being open. They said, well, if you had something to hide, you wouldn't have done this. And so therefore openness pays. And my colleagues don't understand this, because they've never experienced it. We, with HIV, we did we did everything wrong in the first 5-10 years. And then we realized, openness. And from that point on, I went to big scientific conference, and I would be listening to a plenary lecture from Randy Schultz, or from a drug addict, and talking about, the problems. And we were trying to assimilate, and being there and seeing these people helped us sort of realize it was a bigger picture. It wasn't just us playing with bits and pieces of viruses. There's a bigger picture. There's society, there's pain, there's bleeding, there's death. And it did us a world of good. And the flu people just battened down. It's rather sad, but you have to tackle things on. And if you tackle things head on, people give you credit, and they realize they can trust you people because you're not afraid of opening up.
Well, let's go back for a quick second about just the way in which the journals and peer review were exploited. It's trying to think of the right word here. We had a structure, the scientific publication structure that existed prior to COVID had a lot of flaws, but as you point out, there are some benefits to it. It's not like all bad, but what COVID showed, a lot of the things that like COVID showed is that it really exemplified, like it shone a bright light on the the flaws and how those flaws could be exploited by scientists to do a tremendous amount of harm, in the sense of like putting
No,
stuff
not
out there.
necessarily. No, not
So-
harm, to protect themselves. It's
well,
primarily
but it did harm. I mean, resulting in harm.
exactly.
Resulting in harm.
It hurts the enterprise. It hurts.
It hurt. But
learning.
so if they want to protect themselves,
They
that's
protect
whatever the
themselves.
motivations are.
Yes, yes,
The
yes.
outcome of their decisions cause great harm. So we
Yes.
see
That's it. That's the way round. It's personal protection, and if science goes wayward, that's someone else's problem. But the first thing is to protect themselves. Yes, but it's true that you can't comment on information that's not available.
one of the things that came up in the discussion of proximal origin is what we include and what we don't include, right? Like, so the idea is that you can kind of mislead in two ways. Well, sorry, you can just deliberately lie, but that and just state a falsehood, but then you can also sort of lie by omission. Like you decide that we're going to exclude this because it doesn't fit with what our kind of agenda is or whatever. I will say that in those discussions, one of the things that, was actively discussed from the get-go was whether or not a paper would be appropriate. Some of the authors of Proximal Origin were early on expressing concern with even putting something out. That's clear in those discussions, and to me it looks like there was pressure, literally pressure, from the administrators involved, Farrar, Collins, Fauci, to publish something that ultimately led to them making that decision to publish something. But what I will say, just to your point about it kind of works. I don't know if I want to say there's sides in this, but a lot of people are, there's a lot of active discussion about like when the sources of information that are being withheld are discussed, that there's a lot of discussion about information being withheld in China and not enough discussion, or if you talk about information in China being withheld, but you don't mention anything about stuff in the US, that somehow you have an agenda and you're compromised. So I will, in that regard, I will say that there's for me, it's very disturbing that sources of people in the US, Ralph Barrick in particular is who I'm referring to, have been preventing, have actually been, it looks to me, hiding information that may or may not be relevant to the origin of the pandemic. But it is the case that it's not just obfuscation and withholding of information from China, but there's withholding of information from sources in the United States. And when this is discussed, when we have these discussions or when there's Twitter discussions about it and people don't talk about every place it might have come from and then you're accused of also having an agenda and trying to withhold or like direct attention away. But so with that, I'll simply just say that I think both you and I agree that we should be exploring all possible sources of information relevant to the origin of the pandemic, whether they're in the US or out of the US.
We need to get to this because 6 years down the line, we still don't have a good idea. This is not normal. There are some things lacking. And there was a paper recently that came out in Cell trying to analyze and explain why the data suggested that the SARS-2 virus was natural. It came out this year, and it was written up by Carl Zimmer in the New York Times. Now, I'm going to be writing an essay on that one. And that paper has problems for me as just a virologist. If I was speaking with you, I would say there's some analytical bits and pieces, but they try to establish a correlation and they don't prove anything, and they mix things together. And that paper, it should not be in the paper is not strong enough to be in Cell. So I see it as, again, the establishment trying to sort of defend the fact and trying to show by hook or by crook that it is a natural thing. They're pushing their analyses too far. They're making correlations, and the sort of the logical sequence of arguments that we use to prove something is not present in that paper, but it was in a top journal. Carl Zimmer sort of basically said, more evidence that it's natural. Sorry, not true according to me, and therefore I would say that this is the beginning of the peer review process. That paper has some weak sides to it, and I don't agree that this demolishes the lab leak at all. And I'm a virologist. I cut my teeth on hepatitis B and moved into HIV from the beginning, and know evolution of viruses pretty well. Um, I mean, don't mean to sort of compliment myself, but at a meeting I organized in Germany, I asked a question of Ron Fouchier, who did the H5N1 gain of function experiment. And he said to me, it was very kind of him, he said, well, you know virus evolution better than almost anyone else. And I don't mean to be, I'm not a gatekeeper. I don't pretend to be, and I don't try to be. I don't believe in gatekeepers. But I do know that, and I don't see that paper as being definitive in any way, and I would not have recommended it to sell for publication. Maybe in a smaller journal where you can take a risk and sort of say, well, it wasn't the best, but it has some good points. But for a top journal like Cell, no way, no way. And it's the establishment wanting to sort of say it cannot be. I've seen this too many times. There are too many things that are not right about the SARS virus and the way that the virology is handling it. Let's take a recent example. There was Matt Ridley spoke about COVID origins in the NIH Freedom Lecture Series. He gave the inaugural presentation, and he spoke about the arguments as to why the lab leak was still a viable, and he put down on slides all the reasons for this. And you can say, well, I agree more with that or the natural. Let's put that aside. Where was the pushback? Because in the NIH, they have this division of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is got full of great infectious disease experts, virologists, bacteriologists, people who know how microbes work and function. And if this gentleman who is a science writer, he has a PhD in science, but his career is a science writer, and if they disagree with him, and if the overwhelming opinion of virologists across the globe is it's natural, well, where was the pushback? No one dared push back. No one dared. There were tangential remarks, politely expressed, which is good, but nothing serious to wrong foot Matt Ridley at all. And we're in the temple of American science, the NIH, and these people can't defend their natural origins. On Twitter, fine. But in public, in front of the NIH director, no.
Oh, Blue Sky, actually. I think the most the commentary was mostly on
My
Blue Sky.
apologies. Okay, Blue Sky. Right. Now, are they afraid of letting rip in front of the NIH director? Well, it's the same thing we had with dangerous gain of function. There was this piece in the Washington Post that sterilized any opinion. You could not have another opinion. So the virologists, they're all ready to speak up in scientific and blogs and whatever. And when it's important to speak up in front of the NIH director, they don't have the courage to do it. So I don't think the natural people, the natural zoonosis crowd, they give me problems because they don't have the courage. And on top of that, I've pointed out a number of times that we don't have enough bat viruses because this is another issue. So the people are not wanting to get to grips with this. And I would have hoped that we could have declassified far more intelligence. Not just American, we know the Germans have said they have intel, but they won't release it. Wait a minute, with 25 million dead, and if it's been underestimated, this means it could be 30 million more. And who are you? Who are you when you sort of say, 30 million don't count? Because if it was 200 million, it still wouldn't count because so there's something very wrong.
So with regard to the Ridley lecture, I particularly, I thought Matt did a really nice job. He was the presentation I enjoyed, and he handled, the questions.
Yes, and he spoke
Some of the
clearly.
questions were I kind of thought they were, frankly, I thought some of the questions, these like gotcha questions, were stupid. Like they literally were stupid. But Matt handled them with grace, or what, and it was polite. And I don't think anyone, if they would have pushed back even more hard, like vigorously there, that would have been a problem. I think there's a lot of the
Oh,
online
it
chatter
would have
from the
been good if someone had tried to push back in that fact it was on live and with the NH directive. That sure that people wouldn't have started using ad hominem remarks. And what was crucial was the quality of the argument. So it was an opportunity was lost. But as you say, Matt handled everything just as a scientist should, politely and firmly. And I thought his presentation was clear. You can disagree with it, but he didn't overstep, and he explained it himself well. And no one could rise to the occasion.
Well, here's the thing. Online, the virologists that were responding, a lot of the chatter was about you can't cite any papers, there's no peer review. One person asked, what experiments have you done on this subject, which is ridiculous given that the zoonosis crowd actually hasn't done any experiments themselves, frankly. But the key point, too, is that to your point, there was no pushback from the crowd, although that was limited to the NIH people there. And the virologists were saying, oh, it would be so brave. There's you'd have to have so much courage, like kudos to people that would push back in that situation. It would take so much tremendous courage. I would give a counterpoint there. And frankly, just a piece of advice. And I would welcome people, at least in public settings, that include, because you're talking about, oh, it's so brave to stand up and speak with the NIH director there, saying something that you fear might cause retaliation from him. Understand that he has branded himself as someone that welcomes free and open debate, right? So in fact, you actually have an opportunity. I would argue that you really should be more like publicly confrontational if you desire to be so, because that is what he is calling for. And that is his brand. He's saying, I want that.
He has said people should feel that if they disagree with me, they should say, Dr. Bhattacharya, I think you're wrong on this point, and I'll give you the reasons 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's it. Game over. Or you feel that my arguments aren't very good. You go, you yin and yang, and the conversation can be really tough. But
Right.
It can be terribly tough and polite. The idea that you can criticize someone and you have to be nasty and use the F word or other things is just stupid. You can be you can be polite and you can be very, very hard on the person opposite you. And this is perfectly normal, and this is what you want. And if people think you need tremendous courage, then thank you for saying that. Think of the whistleblowers who have been burnt for trying to speak up about something that the establishment didn't want to know. There's a long list of whistleblowers. I'll mention just one. I mentioned Dr. Nelson Rees. He said years back that many of the cell lines that scientists were using were contaminated by this famous cell line called HeLa, H-E-L-A. And when he got so much crap, he was treated like
A pariah.
he was a pariah. And someone even offered him, he joked, he said, I've actually had an offer of a one-way ticket out of the USA. He's no longer with us in this world. He was treated like, unfortunately, I have to use the S word, he was treated like shit. And all he was trying to say was to tell people that, some of these cell lines you're using are contaminated. Now, in the modern world, with all the techniques that we have, this is now part of quality control. But what he was saying is, some of the papers that are published are not sound. And of course, his error was to assume that the people on those papers would welcome his remarks. They couldn't accept criticisms of papers that they had published. And so he was the whistleblower, and he took a pounding for it. So when these people say you have courage, think of Nelson Rees, and he did us a service, but he paid, and his career was drastically altered. I think he was the NH even. Yes. And he suffered, poor guy. And there are other people like him.
So to sort of just finalize the point I was trying to make with respect to,
Sorry, I'm probably going off on a tangent.
no, that's fine. No, I just want to make it clear, because I think I was being a little, I know, just to be precise in what I was trying to say about
Yeah, sure.
his current, like part of his, public statements and his mission or vision for the NIH involves making it okay to express dissenting viewpoints. And with that, anyone in an audience that says, I'm afraid to do so, I would simply just say that, like, the director himself has made multiple public statements saying that he would like to welcome dissenting viewpoints and people should not be afraid to voice them publicly. So
Yeah,
that's it. Like, so unlike, and that's not something that was like said and part of like the governing principles of prior NIH directors. So that's a new thing. And you don't have to trust what he's saying that he will follow through on that. I'm just simply saying that, like, by his own, like, one of
yes.
his big pillars is to allow that to happen and
Yes,
take that for what
and
it's worth.
it is so sad that the scientists can't sort of say, "Okay, well, I'll take you up on your word." They are
Well, it requires trust. It requires trust. And so if you don't trust people,
ah,
you're not gonna do
so
that.
we
If you
come
don't
back to
trust
theory
that
of you,
what
okay?
people's
You have to trust your colleagues, and if you can't trust your
you can't
colleagues,
trust.
the science system has problems. It's and these come
Right.
up when we discuss the downsides. The plus sides, um, it's hard doing science, and it takes time sometimes to get to what we call the truth, but we get there, and that's because this is why we can handle 60% of cancers and cardiac disease. We can, as long as you get to the clinic, medics can keep you alive. So yeah. But this is so sad, and people are afraid, and yet in private they will say all sorts of things. No, courage is in short supply.
I would say there's the courage piece, but then this goes back to this trust element. That is
Yes,
to say that if you don't trust that he's saying what that his actions align with his words, then you shouldn't speak out because you won't believe that, like, if I say something, there won't be any negative ramifications. So without that trust, until one measure for if the idea of establishing and restoring trust at the NIH is happening would be to see more people willing to stand up and ask sort of confrontational or questions that might require this courage you're talking
no,
about. So
yeah,
there's courage and there's trust.
yeah. No,
And
I can
it's hard.
understand that people are, well, what in a company, well, what does the boss think? But wait a minute, this is science. And there's so many examples which showing that if you are more concerned about what the boss thinks, then you're going to slow down the scientific enterprise. It's questioning. We question, we question, we question. And when a paper comes out, the first thing you should do is question. So this paper I mentioned that was commented on by Hans Carl Zimmer, this cell paper. The first thing is that solid? And you read it and you say, are there mistakes in there? Did they do this? Did they do this control? What is it? Is that an approximation? And you go into it hoping, trusting that they did a good job. And when you start finding errors, or when you start sort of saying, that's not quite right, this is a correlation, it's not proof, that you build up an opinion. You say, well, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, that wasn't a very good paper. And we do this all the time. And we read papers, and then we read our colleagues' papers, and some are, absolutely superb. You see, gosh, I wish I had realized that, or I wish I had done that. And you say, oh, he beat me to it, or there's some wonderful stuff there. But there's a lot of so-so stuff. And then you have a small proportion where you say, well, yeah, that's not too good. And there are some, as I mentioned, this famous stat paper that was published in Nature and was hyped up by Nature, and it started to come to pieces in 3 weeks. Something was wrong. And so peer review is just the beginning of quality control. So all readers and listeners, please remember, and when you hear or read up something commented in a big journal, Washington Post, New York Times, say, fine, this is the beginning of, it could well be true, but I must be careful to make sure this is not, I must take this as gospel, because it is possible that someone somewhere will see an error, or they'll see something and they say, gosh, they got that wrong. And that stimulates you to do an experiment. Often when you see a paper that's not quite right, it gives you an idea of an experiment, and then it helps you advance. So yeah, it's the beginning. It's part of a process, and please don't believe that everything that's published is correct.
Oh, trust me, I don't think the people listening or watching this think that at all. I don't think we have that problem. But perhaps they think all of it's fake is the problem, and we need to at least convince them that it's not everything. One thing I did want to mention on that SAGO report, I believe you had said 23 out of the 27 authors of the SAGO commission were participants in that Nature article or op-ed commentary.
23, 27, yeah.
Right. I believe 4 of them didn't because they didn't agree with some of the content of it, which
Yes,
I
well,
believe.
fine.
Right.
But there was just dissent within.
Dissent. And I think it was because of the inclusion of lab origin, too much lab origin stuff, speaking to this idea that people, the scientific community at large is unwilling to sometimes even address, right? So
Not whatever. They exert their right
their rights to withdraw their name, right? So
to
whatever their
disagree,
reasons.
and
Right.
they you may not agree with them, but this is part of science.
Right, but it speaks to I'm saying nobody was withdrawing their name because there was too much natural origin stuff, so that tells you
Oh,
something.
but no, because
Right.
that's the dominant thing.
That's the dominant thing, so that gets back to trust. But going to so let's talk the final thing maybe. Do you wanna talk about this, Government Accountability Office report real quick
Oh,
about how,
yes, well,
relation to the journals and how peer review and journal articles are used and,
yes, so
um
we've as usual, we've been speaking too much. Yeah, so the US, government of what is it? Government Administrative Office's,
Government Accountability Office, report to
So basically,
congressional.
this is the oversight. So they look and see how, government money is, spent. So they make sure that it's not being misspent, and then they look how it was spent, and, this it must be a nightmare office because they have to cover all the specialties in U.S. government, which ranges from defense to social care to environmental protection to science. And then in science, the vastness of science from, say, physics to biology, not to mention chemistry and artificial intelligence. Anyway, they did it on high-risk research, which was basically high-risk microbial research. And their conclusion was that the process isn't transparent as it could be, and that they recommended more transparency from HHS. Okay, fine. But what's interesting is that the writers are clearly going over backwards to understand and show their sources and how they went about it. It's very touching. The reading is very turgid, dense, but you see that they are trying to explain how they did this, what databases they used, how they did it. They made a wonderful effort. And they say, well, we relied on peer-reviewed papers because peer-reviewed is like having a stamp of approval. Well, as we've mentioned, it's the beginning of quality control, but people mistake peer review, which is the beginning of a process, with the process of quality control, and once published, it is considered to be good, which it is not. And because they don't have the baggage to go through everything else, so they rely on peer-reviewed papers. And when it comes to dangerous gain of function, most of the virological papers are in favor of doing this work. Okay? So they get into this mess. And they can't get out of it because most of the writers of these journals say that it's good. They interviewed some people, and there was a heterogeneity of opinions. Most said it was worth doing, and some said it was one or two said it was worthless. They don't cite names, but they clearly got through to a few people who said, "Yeah, this is worthless." So they need peer review because it's a form of quality control, and they don't have the knowledge themselves to sort of make the value judgments. So they rely heavily on peer review. So when the gatekeepers and the journals, when things get sensitive, like dangerous gain of function, COVID origins, and a few other areas, environmental pollution, climate change, you can imagine very tense situations. This is where peer review goes wrong. And in dangerous gain of function, you couldn't speak out because, well, actually, the interesting thing about the irony of the dangerous gain of function is that the article that blocked, closed, slammed the doors closed, wasn't even published in Nature or Science. It was published in the Washington Post. Yet, because it came from the director of the NIH and the director of the NID, it didn't matter. It was in a non-peer reviewed, it was an opinion, and that was enough to stifle dissent. Administrators shouldn't be stifling dissent, and Dr. Bhattacharya has sort of said, dissent, okay, speak up. I want to know. If it's important enough, I want to know. And if you disagree with me, you disagree with me. I might disagree with you, but let's have a discussion. And that's the way it should be. And the more we discuss sensitive issues in science, the better it will be. Scientists can handle the arguments, and if we can't make a consensus, we just say it's too early. We don't need politics. We don't need administrators telling us what to do.
Right. It doesn't always have to be in a journal. It can also be using in the media. And in the case of gain of function, the most important thing was the Washington Post op-ed. In the case of COVID origins, I would say the
proximal
journals were the
origins.
ones. Right.
That's right.
So they use the journals for the COVID origins to direct the public discourse and scientific discourse in one direction. And in the case of gain of function, they used a Washington Post editorial. And probably it was because that was actually not just a scientific debate. There were lawmakers getting involved. I think at that time, there were lawmakers that were concerned about the activities of the NIH being very dangerous to the public. And that I think at the sort of like landscape of the debate perhaps determined where the best messaging needed to go out. So maybe sort of sum up here, Simon.
Yeah.
We've defined problems, which are with respect to the journals and peer review. And here we're talking about how the fact that people who are like SAGO and also the Government Accountability Office, when you're heavily relying upon only a certain subset of information, that is information that's put into scientific journals, that's a problem, especially if that information isn't fully reliable or is agenda driven. And so that being a general description of the problem, I guess I would end by offering that there are solutions to this, at least in my opinion. I think two that I'll mention. One is, as I alluded to earlier, I think journal reform should simply involve getting rid of the journals like as gatekeepers, just removing, and this could be done through the NIH by no longer allowing NIH grant awardees to use funds to support journal publication fees. That's my opinion, to abolish the journals in their current form and use preprint servers and post-publication peer review. That's one. I think two, which is perhaps a better solution, what will actually be maybe more effective just on the general issue, which is having trustworthy information communicated to both others, between scientists to scientists as well as to the public, is the reproducibility initiative. If that can really take off, this replication initiative, reproducibility initiative that the NIH is hopefully launching soon to address what's been referred to as the replication or reproducibility crisis, I actually see that as a potentially, well, not just potentially, to me, that's where if efforts are placed into that area and we have more people doing independent replication or more voices contributing to subjects, then we will get closer to the truth. If there's incentive to reproduce things and to validate things that are in the literature, that to me, long term, can only benefit everybody involved.
And the new NIH director has got this discussion going on what to do about journals. I don't think that there's any decision, but things can take time. And the reproducible issue, yeah, absolutely right. He's trying to get discussion, and with this NIH lecture series of freedom of speech. I mean, freedom of speech, and it's hugely important. And I think I said in my essays that in using peer-reviewed papers, as a scientist, you sift through them and you separate the good ones from the less interesting ones. Okay, the bad ones are few and far between, but there are always a few bad ones. But you sift through them, and you say, these are the ones that I consider really super, and these are the ones I can put to the side because they're not too important. And in the outside, in today's work, outside, you have some wonderful stuff. And as I said, I would recommend looking at the Gilles Demonoeff's analysis of proximal origins, and you can, some with scientific baggage like you and me, we can go through that and we sift the wheat from the chaff, whether it's in the published literature or the non-published literature. It's doing the sort of the analysis is exactly the same. The problem for us is all these intelligence communities who don't give us anything in terms of data, yet they give us an opinion. They said weekly, I don't know their classification, which is highly coded for them. But for us, since we can't see the data, these opinions are out there, but we can't handle them. So when the Germans say they're pretty convinced it's a lab leak, I would say, fine, but I'm a skeptical. I want to see your data. Did you analyze your data well? Because you can make mistakes. And I want to see it. I don't want to be fed opinions. I want to see the data, and this is what scientists do, skeptical optimism. We have to be skeptics. So this is the hard part. So declassify, let us look at some of that stuff. 30 million deaths later, I think that's not a big ask.
It is not.
Not in my book, not in your book. And probably our listeners would agree with us on that.
One thing I want to just clarify, or maybe I realized I was a little bit, I didn't explain something about this, how replication ties into this, which is that the fact that you can have a situation, an ecosystem where journal articles are the key drivers of everything. And they're the main sources of information.
Okay.
In that, and I don't think that should be the case, but assume that is operable. Then right now, our current ecosystem in science does not incentivize replication. Replication and reproducing results doesn't get you top tier publications.
Doesn't get you
if at
promotion,
all. Doesn't get you promotions, right? So there are no incentives in science right now to do replication. So that means that the pool available for assessing, whatever truth or what policy is already biased towards individuals that were first to publish. And so the idea would be that if the more reproducible publication, the more experiments are done that are published, the more reproducibility there is directed in specific areas will produce more papers, and then that produces a wider range of information that can be used in the various ways that you're going to use it in the situation where you're just relying on journal articles or whatnot. So that, I guess, to explain why I was linking reproducibility to the issue with over-reliance on journals. That's why I was saying what I was saying, as my view of what solution-based, looking forward of how we can make the world better. That's one path I see forward, especially because it's been stated as a priority of Kennedy said it in his confirmation hearing that he thought, I forget, a significant fraction of the NIH budget should be directed towards reproducibility. It showed up in the MAHA report, and then also the NIH director has been talking about it recently, and they put up a website. So I hope that succeeds. I see that as something that can be very, very, very powerful in changing science for the better moving forward.
We can throw out these big thoughts It's important they're discussed openly, and in several places. If it was just discussion in DC or inside the NIH, no, it needs to take it a little bit on the road, have webinars, get Canvas opinion, get people discussing. There are lots of intelligent people out there, consult, and get their opinions and, get some discussion. It was just going back to the Matt Ridley lecture, there was an opportunity for people to say, discuss the pros and cons. And the people who we know, the most of the virologists, didn't seize the opportunity. So it's there's a lot of hard work at the scientific community, doesn't like to discuss things openly. We've got into a habit of doing it behind closed doors, and maybe that was fine, but there are times like when COVID, or where did it come from, or dangerous gain effect. Should we be making the equivalent of novel biological weapons in civilian labs paid for by the NIH? Things like that. This is when scientists have to become open. And it's not the whole of science. Most people would be deadly bored by some of the experiments that I used to be doing, or that you would do in your lab. But when it hits a nerve and the public, it shows interest, rather than just say, "Oh, well, the latest discovery of some purine bases on some asteroid that the Japanese recovered," which is fascinating stuff. But well, this is done anyway by Neil deGrasse Tyson and other people. But when the downside of science, or when things start to go slightly wrong, then that's where we need to discuss. And very few people have the courage to do it. And Dr. Bhattacharya, the NIH director, seems to want to do it. So give him the time, because he's going to have to change some mindsets. As we saw, no one was prepared to sort of defend the natural origin of COVID at that meeting. Things are going to take time, so he needs time. You're going to have to give time to that, and hopefully things can change. Hopefully, I would love them to change, because if not, then people are going to mistrust science, and that is going to cost lives. Seriously, going to cost lives down the road.
Well, you end on a somber note, and I was about to say we will always be here podcasting as to give hope to everybody. Like, this will always be a place where we will try to bring honesty and our best sort of like, that's the podcasting. I think
that's
is
right,
where
but
this should happen.
We can be even more. We can just say, look, this is the way we think. We discuss. We don't
Right.
always agree, and
Take it or
our
leave it.
listeners can say, well, what Simon just said 17 minutes ago is a load of rubbish. Fine, but at least we can get discussion out there. You can disagree with it. I can say something that provokes you and makes you think. Well, if I said something stupid that made you think, well, actually, it's very useful because it helps you sort of crystallize your thoughts, so on and so forth. And freedom of speech, freedom to disagree. And if you don't like what we say, you just don't listen to us. Turn off. But
Or if we say something dumb, we could go viral,
useful.
and then that would draw more eyeballs onto our podcast.
We try to get there's complicated information which is hidden in virology that is not seen because scientists don't speak enough about their fields. And as I've said, it's time and time again, it's such a fascinating field, and it cuts across so many things. And I would be doing bench work, and then the next day I would have in my lab an old school friend. We were in primary school. This was years ago. We were in primary school together, and he got HIV. And he came to see me. He sought me out. He saw I'd been working on HIV. So virology takes you from your bench work on genetics and individual bases and which ones impact this protein and that. And then the next day you're talking to an old school friend you haven't seen for 20 years who's sort of saying, I'm advanced, I've got full-blown AIDS. And we had this long talk for 3, 4, 5 hours. And virology has this fantastic span. It's a very rich subject, fascinating subject, and I can talk endlessly about it. And we do good. We do. We do. We could quickly sort out who had COVID, who didn't have COVID, and therefore, if you had COVID, you wouldn't go and see your grandmother, your grandfather, because you could spread it. So yeah. But it's not easy, it's not fun, and it takes time and patience, and in our modern world, people don't have patience, but science is overall a force for good. That's my humble opinion, but there we are.
We're trying, like we said, we're trying to sort out the good, the bad, and the ugly in the field of virology, and trying to. That's what we're doing, I guess. I mean, our assessment, or perhaps, I mean, even like you're the virology
We
expert, and I am.
end with Clint Eastwood, who's fabulous. Yeah, absolutely,
That's
great.
right. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Look
Great.
at everything.
Great.
So, all right. Well,
Wonderful.
Simon,
Yes,
once again, thank you very much for
Pleasure,
joining me
sir. We'll be in
on
touch.
on another episode of In Defense of Virology. Until next time, my name is Bryce Nichols. Take care, everybody.